So anyone in the room have some strong opinions about pie charts? Probably. Are pie charts good? Are pie charts bad? I feel like the conversation has actually evolved a lot over the last few years. I think most people in the room would agree with me. The answer is, it depends. I think that's the answer to a lot of debates around data visualization. And it might feel kind of unsatisfying, but the reason it depends is because when we're making charts, what we are doing is communicating, and communication is something that depends. So for data visualization, it depends on the data, it depends on the medium you're communicating with, and more than anything, it depends on the audience. So there's a good term for what things depends on. It depends on the context. And there's a bunch, and so there are fields outside of data visualization that can actually, it might feel unsatisfying to just say it depends on context, but we don't actually have to stop there. We can actually have tools from other fields to look at how context impacts meaning. So the field I'm talking about today is linguistics. Within linguistics, there's a subfield called pragmatics that is all about how context impacts meaning. So before we get into linguistics, I'm going to give you a little bit of context about myself. I'm not a linguist. I'm not a scientist. After that climate change talk, I feel a little less comfortable saying that I'm not a scientist, but as I said, I'm a data engineer. If you ask me what a data engineer does, I will also tell you it depends. And I'm definitely not a data visualization professional. I feel a little kind of out of my element, kind of in front of all these superstars, but I'm also not an imposter. So one way I like to describe myself is as a former future linguist. So here we are almost in 2019 at Tapestry. Way back in 2010, I started a PhD program, Ohio State University, studying linguistics. The plan was to spend 5-6 years, hopefully not much longer, working on my PhD, then becoming a linguistics professor. So back then, I was a future linguist. But plan did not work out with reality, so a couple of years later, I became a former future linguist. In addition to having studied linguistics, I have one other qualification, which is I'm a native speaker of charts. I've had a lot of different roles with a bunch of different titles, and all of them I've been making charts. When I have data that I want to understand, I make a chart. When I have data that I want to communicate, I make a chart. Also, there's always been this disconnect between the charts that help me understand the data and then the charts that I share with other people for them to understand. I very often run into this issue where I have this perfect chart, it makes so much sense to me, I hand it off to someone and they just go, Alex, what the hell does this mean? And so I think what that all comes down to is context. So linguistics is the scientific study of natural language. When we're talking about linguistics, we're talking about how people actually talk. We're not making value judgments about how they should speak. Linguistics is a huge field. We're going to get to pragmatics, but I think it's worth spending one slide kind of breaking down the various subfields of linguistics. So first we've got phonetics. Phonetics has to do with the actual sounds people make when they speak, where you move your tongue to make an S sound versus a Z sound. Actually, that's your vocal cords, all sorts of stuff like that. Phonology is the abstract representations of these sounds, kind of maps closely to vowels and consonants, and has a lot to do with how the different sounds can combine in different languages. Then we move on to morphology. Morphology is the study of the smallest units of language that actually have meaning. Think of the S at the end of plurals in English. That S means something in a way that the S in the middle of linguistics doesn't mean anything. It's just a sound. Then we get to syntax. Syntax is this, how words combine within a structure to give you a structure of a sentence. We move on to semantics, which is how the meaning of those words, given a syntactic structure, gives you the meaning of the sentence. But once you get to a sentence, you still don't have the full meaning. To get the full meaning, you need to get to pragmatics, which takes context into account. And the one thing is, while pragmatics is most closely related to semantics, when you're processing language, you're actually building up the phonology, the syntax, and the semantics all at the same time, all using context clues. So utterances. Utterances are sentences in context. A sentence is an abstract representation. It doesn't have a speaker. It doesn't have a time or location. An utterance is a particular instance of a sentence. So if we say, this is a great chart, we're talking about one particular chart. We can say the same sentence as another utterance This is a great chart. Those two things are different sentences. One could be true, one could be false. That is an utterance. All right, and so as a linguist, what you kind of do as a formal linguist is set up these like very artificial contexts so that you can like analyze a tiny bit of language. So for the rest of this talk, we're going to deal with a single artificial context. That is, the owner of Fake Mart has been selling 2 products, and they're only going to sell one going forward. They're trying to figure out which one to sell. Ask the business analyst, what should we do? Business analyst comes back and says, sell product A. The owner is unpersuaded. Let's try using a chart. Owner of Fake Mart, A or B? Analyst comes back with a nice line chart, very classic chart in business analytics. Time is on the x-axis, money is on the y-axis, 2 lines going in the same direction, then they diverge. Owner likes the chart, goes with A. Data-driven decision-making at its finest. This is not a beautiful chart, but it gets the job done. This is the good chart. From here on out, the charts get worse and worse. All right, and it gets pretty complicated, but just to like give you some instance on my background, a bunch of different ways I have uttered charts. Sometimes I'm sitting next to someone talking through exactly what it is. Sometimes it's happening over email or Slack. Sometimes it's within analysis. Number 6 is, at this one job, I would like make a chart, hand it off to my boss, who would hand it off to his boss. It just kind of like floated out into the ether. I never really understood what was happening. And then the 7th one, I haven't really kind of figured out how context and pragmatics kind of comes into this, but most of the charts I make are just to understand things myself, just kind of sitting in my RStudio console making ggplot after ggplot. All right, so back in 1967, a foundational paper in pragmatics was by a logician named H.P. Grice, and he was trying to figure out why it is within language that people seem to draw a lot of conclusions that you can't actually draw from a formal logic. And he came up with the idea around this called the Co-Operative Principle, which is make your contribution such as it is required at the stage at which it occurs by the accepted purpose or direction of the talk exchange in which you are engaged. It's a bit of a mouthful, but the basic idea is when you're having a conversation, there's either an explicit or usually an implicit goal of what the point of the conversation is, and you trust that your people you're speaking with are cooperating, and they trust that you are cooperating. Grice breaks this down into 4 conversational maxims. These are like the kind of unwritten rules of communication that we are all following these when we communicate. And so the rest of the talk will be kind of laying through the conversational maxims and trying to apply them to data visualization. So first we've got the Maxim of Quality. Do not say what you believe to be false. Do not say that for which you lack adequate evidence. So this one feels less like it has to do with data visualization and more like it has to do with data analysis. Data quality is actually its own kind of term. And I think a lot of what we run into in issues with data visualization is not really understanding the data we're working with or not really understanding how messy it might actually be. Someone who's now a data engineer, I promise you, your data is messier than you think it is. It goes on to the Maxim of Relevance. So in Grice's terms, he calls it the Maxim of Relation. All he says is be relevant. So in terms of data visualization, back to our example, owner of Fake Mart wants A or B. Here's the cooperative version. Line goes up, line goes down. This is a very relevant chart of plotting A or B. If we gave him this chart instead, this would be super, super uncooperative, that we're now plotting C and D. This is not usually a mistake people make. The more realistic mistake, at least in business context, is something like this, where we, rather than daily profit, we give them daily revenue. Tells the wrong story, it is uncooperative, probably not purposely, but this will lead to miscommunication. Then we get into the Maxim of Manner. Avoid obscurity of expression, avoid ambiguity, be brief, avoid unnecessary prolixity, which I don't know what it means, so again, number 1, avoid obscurity of expression. And number 4, be orderly. So in terms of data visualization, I think this really comes down to kind of following conventions and understanding the conventions that your audience expects. And so one thing about pie charts is you can, like, as much as we might hate pie charts, our audience knows exactly how to read them. And so here is a chart that violates the Maxim of Manner. It took me such a long time in ggplot to make the scale on the x-axis go from right to left instead of left to right. But here, it's the exact same data, but now you have to do this cognitive leap to actually figure out that the dates go in the wrong direction. This is super uncooperative again. Lastly, we have the maximum of quantity. I'm going to spend a little more time on this one. It applies to data visualization even better than the first three. Make your contribution as informative as required for the current purpose of the exchange, and do not make your contribution more informative than required. So you've got this nice little kind of Goldilocks setup. I'm going to do a linguistic example first. And so if the question is, what did you have for lunch? A good cooperative answer would be lasagna. If you wanted to give a very unhelpful example that is not informative enough, maybe you just say food. And on the other side, here is a recipe for lasagna that I Googled. If you answer this, they would hate you just as much. And so I think in data visualization, we know not to under-inform, but over-informing can be just as big a problem. So back to the owner of FakeMart, here's the good cooperative version. Not enough information. We can do this in a couple different ways. I'm going to run through a bunch of different ways where we over-inform and under-inform. So first is, he asks about whether we should do A or B. If you come back with just a plot of A, that is definitely not enough information. On the other side, add a bunch of other series in. That's not very helpful either. But that's not the only way we can over-inform or under-inform. So consider another situation in which we cut off the x-axis before A takes off and kind of surpasses B. I think B goes down after this in the first version. You might draw the wrong conclusion from this data. You probably would draw the wrong conclusion from this data. On the other side, we might show too much of the x-axis and have some boring stuff in September that is not really relevant for answering the question. Another example of this is if we showed hourly profit instead of daily profit for a FakeMart, by the way, is open from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., we get this terrible chart that just has way too many data points on it. On the other side, if we just showed profit for October and November, we might be missing a lot of information as well. And so what's going to be just right is really going to depend on context, but you got to be careful not to over... Oh, I think I got those backwards, huh? Oh, man. I'm sorry. All right, let's tweak it. Oh man, sorry, okay. All right, back on track. One more example of this. This one is super fun. So we might also over-inform or under-inform with labeling. So we might not have enough information by not including any axis information. This is like too much of a very extreme case, but I think there are a lot of like good, clear charts that just don't have the right labels on it. And then on the other side, too much information could label every single point in the plot. This is not very helpful either. You just don't need this much information to answer the question. But, so okay, these got kind of silly, but these got kind of silly, but it's a lot more complicated than this. So for one, Grace's maxims lack rigor. This was 40 years ago. This is foundational pragmatics. The working linguists today are trying hard to take that be relevant and turn it into a theory that actually makes predictions about how language works. So this is really just a starting off point. In addition to that, even simple charts contain a lot of information. That's not a grammatical sentence either. Jeez. Simple charts, the only reason we reach for data visualization is when sentences fail us. And so when we're talking about data visualization, we're inherently talking about very complex sets of information, conveying something complicated, even when it's just one single static chart. But thirdly, when I called myself a native speaker of charts, my linguistics professors back in Ohio are probably grinding their teeth, because it's not really true at all that you're a native speaker of charts. It's something you have to learn. It's very conventional. That makes it a lot different than natural language. I still think it's useful to kind of think of it as a framework, but again, it gets a lot more complicated. And again, this was just a static chart where I was answering one question with one chart. when most people are doing data visualization, they have an audience bigger than one, or they're doing a dashboard that has some parameters that can change, or thinking about a chart. So my example before of a chart that my manager's manager's manager was going to talk about, there's a whole bunch of different contexts there. And so it makes being good at data visualization good at kind of mind reading and anticipating all these possible contexts. It's usually not just one context. And I think a lot of the best practices around data visualization are basically saying, well, in most of these contexts, you're pretty safe with this, and so stick with the stuff that you can't predict what's going to happen to your chart after you put it out in the world, so just like be on the safe side. And lastly, this all assumes that the cooperative principle is in effect, and there's a lot of kind of data visualization and just communication in the world where that is not true. And so that a lot of my work with data is about building trust so that whoever is reading my chart can understand the data and trust that it is true that I am cooperating. On the other side of this is it's not usually often the case in business situations that someone actually wants a chart to make a decision. I find often someone wants a chart to justify a decision. And so it's a very different context. It's very hard to actually persuade anyone of anything, even if you have the right data. People have already made up their mind. I don't know exactly what to do with this, but I've just been like kind of bummed about it lately. But even though it gets so much more complicated than the situations I set up, I think these rules and thinking through kind of the simple version with these kind of basic ideas is super, super helpful. And so I hope that's what you kind of take away from this. Just a couple new terms for kind of thinking about problems that you've all been thinking about for a while. Just, think about pragmatics. It's a really interesting thing. Go actually read Grice's paper. He uses some funny language, but it's actually pretty readable. So yeah, thanks.